Hi, I'm Chris Sarandon, and welcome to Cooking by Heart, where we revisit the vivid memories of the food we grew up with and the people and the stories attached to that time in our lives. My guest today is Mike Flanagan. Flanagan is an American filmmaker best known for his work in horror movies and television series, attracting the praise of many critics and such film luminaries as directors Quentin Tarantino, the late William Friedkin, and author Stephen King. His films, all of which he has directed, written, and edited, include Absentia, Oculus, Hush, Before I Wake, Ouija, Origin of Evil, Gerald's Game, and Dr. Sleep. He also created, produced, was showrunner, and directed, wrote, and edited episodes of the Netflix supernatural horror anthology series, The Haunting. He's created and directed the Netflix horror miniseries Midnight Mass, as well as the upcoming The Fall of the House of Usher. Among his other projects are an upcoming film adaptation of a Stephen King novella, The Life of Chuck. He is a partner in Intrepid Pictures with Trevor Macy, and under their Intrepid banner, Flanagan and Macy entered into an exclusive overall deal with Amazon Studios in 2023 for their television projects, and have produced feature films for Warner Brothers, Universal Pictures, Netflix, Paramount, among others. He was presented with the Visionary Award by the Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror Films in 2022. I have become a fanboy, by the way. And welcome to Mike Flanagan. Hi, Mike.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a joy to be here.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. So we always start the show with something I call provenance, which essentially is where we're from, because that really informs a lot of what goes on in our lives, particularly our early lives. And you were born in Salem, Massachusetts?
That is absolutely correct. I was.
How fitting.
Yeah, how perfect.
Yes.
Though I was there very briefly. Very briefly. My dad was in the Coast Guard, and so we moved around a ton, and I think I was only in Salem for... it was less than a year, I think.
You don't, but so obviously you don't remember much about actually being there.
I don't, but as I got older and would ask kind of where I came from initially, I became utterly fascinated by the history of Salem. It had a big effect on me. I wish I could remember being there, and I'm dying to go back. But yeah.
Well, we'll get to that in a little while, okay? But in the meantime, let's talk about your parents. Tell me about your mom and dad. Dad, obviously, was he a non-com or an officer in the Coast Guard?
He was an officer. He made it up to he was captain before he retired, and was an XO on the cutters. And then my mother was a Coast Guard wife when we were little, and stayed at home taking care of my sibling and I. And then
so mom was essentially the main cook.
Yeah. Oh yes. And dad would be gone for months at a time, sometimes out on
oh, really?
Boats. We'd have no contact with him. Yeah.
Right. Essentially doing what? Patrol?
Yep. Patrol, and kind of all over the world. And when he was out on the boats, they didn't have any means of communication unless he would handwrite letters, and we would do the same, and they'd come weeks later.
Right.
And sometimes we'd get a phone call if he was in a port city, and had access to a phone. We'd get him on the phone briefly. But.
Wow, I had no idea that the Coast Guard was such a peripatetic kind of existence for the people who were obviously manning the ships and the boats. We always think of it as just being there patrolling our coast, and that's it.
No, he'd go off. He'd be in international waters off Russia and Cuba and South America. And he'd be all over the place. And sometimes those tours would be relatively short. There'd be a few weeks, but sometimes it was months. And my mom would be home alone with my brother and I, and having to kind of juggle us as all on her own.
Was she an accomplished cook? Tell me about mom.
Oh yeah, mom is a wonderful cook, and I was talking to her this morning, actually, because I told her I was going to be on your podcast, and I told her what we'd be talking about, and she was like, "Oh, good Lord, please make sure they know that you guys were the problem. It wasn't my cooking. Because my mom was a wonderful, wonderful cook. And my brother and I just wouldn't eat food.
Oh, really?
We were almost
picky eaters.
Oh my God, yes. And like satirically picky. Like I look at it now and it's so picky that it feels like satire. And now I have 3 kids of my own who are all picky eaters.
Oh, they all are, by the way. Yeah.
It's tough.
We have 9 grandchildren, and watching it again after having gone through it with my kids on and off, because there were times when I was away from my kids. One of the great pieces of advice I ever had about child rearing was from a friend. The first time when my first daughter was born, and basically this woman said, just remember, everything is a phase.
Right.
Meaning that the good stuff and the bad stuff.
Yeah, nothing stays long. The seasons change so fast.
Right. Did you have any favorites that your mom cooked?
Oh, yes. And so she reminded me of some of them, which, oh, wow. So one of them I feel really good about to this day and still brings back, so celery and peanut butter was the staple for us as a snack, which sounds wonderful. And I wish my kids were more into it. But beyond that, I was apparently boiled hot dogs, no bun, no condiments. Right. Frozen peas, but I mean still frozen, out of the freezer bag, right, by the handful.
Right. Pretty healthy when you think about it.
Yeah, it could be a lot worse. Then a lot of pizza.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually, as a child, I was too picky to eat pizza. And she told me,
interesting.
We would go to, there was a pizza place near, in Maryland where we were stationed for a long time that we would go to. And I would only eat the pizza if it was cut in half vertically up the slice and not heated. It had to just be kind of cold off of the display pizza.
Right.
And
tepid pizza. Yum.
Yep. Tepid, narrow pizza. And that was all I would do.
Now, was there something about the shape that was fascinating, or it was just a compulsion of yours that you had to exercise?
She said that I was afraid of getting my hands greasy, and that if I had the long strips and I wasn't holding the whole slice, then the odds of me getting my hands dirty were much lower. So. And that sometimes I would use a fork and knife too.
Yeah. But it very much sounds like, the compulsions that most kids go through. I had a thing about separating everything on the plate.
Yes.
That is, nothing could mix with anything else. Right?
Totally the same. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And the juice from food I liked, if it would run into other food, I would, I have to get rid of the whole plate at this point.
Yeah. Now that probably is a foretelling of haute cuisine in a way, because, when great cooks prepare food, great chefs, they don't mix things. They don't, things don't get mushed together. So what were her specialties that you didn't eat?
So she was wonderful with chicken. She could make chicken flavorful and exciting. She would do a lot of she grew up in a Polish household, and so there was a lot of traditional Polish food that she would make that we wouldn't come near. You know. And then because my father grew up in an Irish household, she had adopted a bunch of traditional Irish dishes. So she would do corned beef and cabbage, and things like that on St. Paddy's Day.
Mm-hmm.
And so she would get adventurous with her cooking, and my brother and I would just completely reject it. Right. And so, she and my father would enjoy it, but there would always be the lukewarm, isolated hot dog, the pile of still frozen peas, and then whatever else, kind of off on the side. Yeah.
What were some of the Polish things that did she actually cook the Polish food?
Yes, I remember her making a really delicious dinner centered around a kielbasa that she would make.
Oh,
and now I would be really interested to have that meal.
Yes,
And
right.
I'm on the other side of the country.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember that very, very much. I remember a number of fascinating casseroles and other kind of combined ingredient dishes that she would make that were completely alien to me.
Mm-hmm.
And then an awful lot of broths and cooked vegetables that she would do that had a unique flavor pattern and spices that I, to me, was just, if it wasn't butter and salt.
Yeah.
Or I would even put ketchup on fresh vegetables at the time. I was a disaster. But But yeah, she was always very, very good about that, and then just stuck with these two boys who just
weren't having it.
We were hostile toward it.
Right. Any cabbage rolls?
Yes. Oh yeah. A lot of cabbage. Yes. And cabbage rolls for sure. I think she did a lot of baking too, if I remember right. There was a lot of really interesting breads and pastries and things like that she would make.
Were you guys into the pastries at all?
No, we were terrible.
Really?
We were really universally terrible. Yeah, we would avoid all of it. And then I think later, especially when Dad was gone on kind of the long deployments, she at that point would just be like, whatever, and just kind of throw down whatever she could.
Yeah. Now, did the menu change when you guys moved? That is, was she taking on at all any of the regional cooking from where you guys were living?
Yeah, and she would also cook for friends. She would have friends, especially other Coast Guard wives and stuff who would come, and I remember her doing bigger meals then. And I remember a lot of cookbooks. I remember a lot of them not only kind of piled up in the kitchen, but a lot of cookbooks that looked very well loved, that when we would flip through them, they had ancient sauces and other things kind of crinkling up the pages. And I remember a lot of that. And I remember distinctly watching television while I ate like an entire bag of it's potato chips for dinner, and smelling kind of everything coming out of the kitchen, and watching her moving around, going off of a recipe from the book and surrounding herself with different things. And it being quite a production that, in retrospect, I think back and think that was for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And most of the time there was no one else there to enjoy it.
Yeah.
We certainly
Well, there's something about the rituals. I don't know. Do you cook at all now?
Very little. And interestingly, and I've been listening to your podcast, and I've heard other guests saying the same, of wanting to introduce it into their lives or explore it more, in no small part because of talking to you.
Yeah, particularly Michael Rosenbaum.
I listened to Rosenbaum. I listened to Rosie. Yes.
Yeah.
And it was the same. I didn't have quite hearing his childhood and kind of how much takeout and kind of fast food, his life was for so long. It hasn't been quite that extreme for me, but I share the same desire he has to kind of, and what you said to him when you said, if you can follow the recipe, you can cook. And that blew my mind a little bit, because I kept thinking, I need to sign up for classes. I need to carve out this time to really, really do this right. And it's like, no, of course, if I can get the right book,
directions. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I know I can follow directions.
Yes.
And I grew up in military household. Directions were everything.
Right. Exactly.
It is something very much on my list. And there are dishes that I can cook and have been able to cook going back into high school and college that are kind of my staples.
Right.
But
I'm going to get to those. So
sure.
Hang on to that thought.
Yeah.
What was it like around the dinner table with the three of you, and on occasion with the four of you?
That was actually a pretty wonderful thing. And we had a circular table in our dining room, and there was no clear head of the table, but we all had our assigned seats. And I don't remember at what point it went that way, but we all always sat in the same place. And we would sit at the table together and we would talk. And Dad would come home from work. Mom would start cooking before he came home. It was very kind of a cliched nuclear family dinner, and Mom would start cooking early. Dad would come home in uniform when he was there, drop the suitcase. They would talk privately and catch up over the day while we putzed around, and then everyone would assemble for dinner, and we would all talk together. And we never had to worry about the things people worry about now with devices and all these other distractions at the table.
Right.
That just wasn't part of our lives then. So
exactly.
And I remember boisterous conversation and laughter and everyone talking about their day, and talking about, stories and memories, and the same table was where we also would gather for board games and family, all the family activities. So I think of that. I sat directly across from my brother. My father sat to my right, my mother sat to my left. I remember it, intuitively. And so dinners were really wonderful and full of interaction.
Except for the eating.
Except for the eating.
Right.
Except for the actual food.
Right. Consuming the food.
Mom and Dad ate great. They really ate well and would just shake their heads at us. And I remember my dad vividly just being like, why won't you eat? Why won't you try foods you haven't had? You're going to like it. And us just being, nope, not interested. Or we would default to, I don't like that food. I don't like potatoes.
Yes.
And huge blanket statements. I don't like pasta. It's like, what are you talking about?
We hear this very often from our kids and their children. Same thing. And when they come to visit us. In fact, tomorrow I've got 3 of my grandchildren and my daughter are coming down for a few days to visit us because they don't live very far away. And I'm prepared for it. And one of the first questions I always ask before they come is, what are they eating now?
Right. And what I've learned about you, you grew up in a restaurant.
Yeah.
It was such a major part of your life. And I believe I heard you say that all of your kids are accomplished cooks, and one is a professionally trained chef.
Yeah.
That they're still having the problems with the grandkids. That they deal with this makes me feel a little better, because there are nights I go to bed just feeling like I've essentially stuffed my children full of cardboard and sugar in order to just send them to bed not hungry.
I get it. I think this is a universal problem. But I must say, one of the things I admire about their kids is they don't necessarily cater to specific tastes. Essentially, they say, this is what we're having for dinner tonight. I did a podcast with my children.
Oh, I've got to find that one.
Yeah, they talked about growing up around food. But one of the things my daughter said is there are always workarounds. For instance, one of her sons went through a no pasta phase, right? So she figured out a way to use the sauce that everybody else was having and make it like a sloppy Joe. Give him a piece of bread that he could put the sauce on, and he would have it. So that they have some agency in terms of their choices on the one hand, but on the other hand, they don't feel like that they can just say, this is an anarchy, and this is anarchic. I'm just going to do whatever the hell I want to do at the dinner table. And they also all are very strict about devices at the table.
That's critical, and that's the thing we've been able to keep to that. We've been able to stick to the no devices at any meal, really.
Right, because what's happened is that the rituals of community that have lasted, that you had when you were growing up, are disappearing in a lot of households all over the country. Now, it first started happening when the advent of television, when television was such a unique thing, and people had TVs sort of sitting by the dinner table, and TV was running as they were eating dinner. The complete sort of obliteration of social interaction as a result of most of us, by the way, being addicted to our devices has taken a toll on the family dynamic.
It really has, and I think it's only getting worse. It's becoming less easy to normalize this time away from the device. And to your point, I have this problem too.
Yeah.
I have the same issue. And because I'm the adult at the table, while they have the no devices rule.
Yeah.
If I'm not careful, I will start checking the phone for work or for other things. I have to make a real effort to get that out of there.
Yep. Me too.
I'm telling them no, but they can watch me do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, when you were growing up, did you guys go out to eat?
We did. We were kind of a lower middle class military family, so we didn't go to fancy restaurants. And for us, if we went out to eat, it was like every couple of months we'd have this awesome family dinner at Red Lobster, and that was where we'd go, and that had kind of it had stuff for my parents that they would like, but then the kids could get the popcorn shrimp and the fried shrimp and all the fried food. And my father grew up in Gloucester, Massachusetts, so he was, of basically a really incredible fishing community, and that was what you did.
Mm-hmm.
And so, he kind of brought all of that with him, and to him it was always particularly kind of frustrating that the kids would just kind of go right for the deep fried shrimp and say, we don't like fish, and he'd be like,
right.
But we'd go out occasionally, and it was always a big event. And I do remember as well that if there was something we had at dinner that the kids liked, like if I remember there were these rolls, these cheesy biscuits that Red Lobster had,
mm-hmm.
and my brother and I just tore through them.
Mm-hmm.
And so my mom would come home and try to recreate whatever it was that we tried and liked. She would try to learn how to prepare it at home.
Oh, how great.
Yeah. And we didn't appreciate that nearly as much at the time as I do now.
Right.
That she would make that effort. And she would do a great job. She would get very close to whatever we had at the restaurant. And that was her way of saying, oh, you liked this? Then let's bring that to the table at home.
Right. Other than the rolls and the popcorn shrimp, any other discoveries that you made along the way that you went, oh, wait a minute?
Steak. I really started to fall in love with steak kind of in my junior high years. I resisted it as a kid. I wouldn't eat red meat. I wouldn't eat hamburger meat. I remember fighting with my parents about not eating hamburger patties.
No, not a kid who didn't eat hamburgers.
Yeah,
there's a children's book there somewhere that somebody should write.
I have a vivid memory of sitting at a table, and I had ripped away, of course, everything that made it a hamburger. I'd gotten rid of the bun, gotten rid of any condiments, so it was just this patty, and I ground it into a paste with my fork, like just completely mutilated it. And refused to eat it. And they said I couldn't get up from the table until I'd eaten the whole hamburger.
Right.
And I remember sitting for hours with this cold ground beef paste that I'd made and shoveling it into my mouth, one bite every 10, 15 minutes and stubbornly refusing to finish it and get up. But I remember when we went to some restaurant that had a really good steak. And then later I remember in high school, I worked, one of my first jobs was as a busboy at Outback Steakhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had the very buttery kind of, the Outback steak experience that super seasoned steak. And thinking, oh yeah, this is great. And I think the other one I remember, really kicking a door open for me was the first time I had sushi, which I didn't have until I was in college.
And
that blew open a whole world for me.
Yeah, I would think. Now, going back just a little bit, what were your school lunches like? That is, did mom make stuff for you to take to school, or did you eat school food?
Both. I remember in elementary school, it was a packed lunch, and that was peanut butter and jelly sandwiches with the crusts removed, and fruit and string cheese. And I look back now, and it's like it was protein, calories,
Yeah.
And the fruit snacks that were kind of, they became
Roll-ups.
currency. Yep, the fruit roll-ups. Fruit wrinkles, fruit by the foot. I remember all of these. and the kids, we'd barter them and trade them, and it really
That's
was
ubiquitous. Yes, that happens everywhere, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's its own ecosystem, its own economy.
Right.
Who had the really good fruit snacks?
Right.
Gushers and fruit, all whatever they were.
Right.
And then in high school, I went to a Catholic high school in Severn, Maryland,
Mm.
and I remember that we had a cafeteria that was just cafeteria food. Except once a week they had a sponsorship deal with Chick-fil-A. And they would come and do sandwiches and stuff, all chicken stuff one day a week.
But then there must have been Fish Fridays, yes?
Yes, yep, we had that.
At the Catholic school.
Oh, yeah. And then that kind of cafeteria eating carried on all through high school. And then with college, it's all bets were off in college.
Did your choices change when you went to college? Did you become more accepting of a wider sort of palette, or did you have a kind of very narrow kind of range of interest?
I did get better, and by now I'd embraced eating heated pizza, which was already in and of itself a major step up.
Ooh,
I know, but I found that I would have kind of 3 or maybe 4 things, and I would go for them every time.
Right.
It was variety was scary to me still.
Mm-hmm.
So I would know that if I went to this particular dining hall on campus, I knew that I could get X, Y, and Z and have a meal. And there was one that would make great sandwiches, but I always got the same sandwich.
What was the sandwich?
Oh, it was an Italian BMT sandwich, and I would do that, or I would do just a basic BLT. I would just do bacon lettuce. That was the one no one could mess up.
Mm-hmm.
But never with mayonnaise or any sauces.
Oh,
yeah, always dry.
Mike. Oh,
I know. I missed out on a whole world. and then in the dorms, I found that the little commissary bookstore by my dorm room had a little tiny frozen food section. And in there, they sold these individual frozen pizzas that you could make in a dorm microwave.
Right.
And they were Mama Celeste's frozen pizzas for one. And that was 80% of my...
That was it.
That was it.
That was
essentially cardboard with sauce. Now I'm just
exactly.
Like, wow. But
exactly.
And then something happened on the way out of college, where suddenly, and I don't know what triggered it. Suddenly, I became interested in eating as many different kinds of food as I could, and variety and adventure, and the fact that I hadn't ever tried something became exciting and a novelty. And I found, much to my mother's profound frustration, that I loved so many of these foods that I had thought I didn't.
Yeah.
And I would call home and be like, oh my gosh, I just had the most amazing escargot, and my mother would be like, you just ate a snail and you wouldn't let me put your hot dog in a bun. I had for years, and I would call up and say, oh, we had the most incredible kind of sushi adventure. We didn't even know what we were ordering. It was just whatever came out was what we would eat. And my mom would be like, I can't believe, after decades of you torturing me, that now your thing is adventuresome eating.
Speaking of mom, because I don't want to lose this one thing that I almost always ask everybody, because it seems to be so vivid for most people anyway. What were holidays like?
Oh, holidays, huge productions from mom. But always with the strangest kind of limitations, because Thanksgiving, for example, my brother and I wouldn't eat turkey. So my mother would either be faced with the choice of preparing an entire turkey for herself and my father,
right,
and then having leftovers for years.
For years, right.
And still having to do something else for us, having to come up with a backup plan.
Mm-hmm.
Or trying to come up with something everyone would eat. I remember there were experiments in there where it was like we had our Thanksgiving ham, because that was something that by then we would embrace.
Willing to, right.
And I remember there would always be the kind of from scratch cranberry sauce in one container that my mother would enjoy. And then there would be the still in the shape of the can cranberry sauce beside
right.
it that we would have,
yes.
So holidays were always she had to work twice as hard because she wanted to do something that was special and that
right.
evoked the holiday, and that was thematically or traditionally linked to the holiday itself, or to her
right.
family's traditions of it, or my father's family's traditions of it, or both. And then she would have the kind of the bullshit version that my brother and I would insist on. So
right,
she had to do both side by side.
Right. Was extended family involved at all when you guys were growing up?
Yes, and I remember sometimes we would drive up if Dad was at sea. And we were on the East Coast. My mom would put us all in the car and drive us to Connecticut, where her mother was, and we'd go to Grandma's house, and they would cook together. And the aunts and uncles. Each of my parents are the oldest of 6 kids.
Oh,
so it was a lot of aunts, uncles, and the cousins, just dozens of cousins,
right,
everywhere.
Right.
And so when we would go up there, it would become a huge event. And I remember same on my dad's side of the family. And so when Mom didn't want to be trapped with us alone, it was safety in numbers, get the whole family going.
Get the hell out of here.
And then other times, because there was a lot of military in our family, and I had one uncle in the Army and another in the Navy, and so we'd end up stationed near each other. And so my aunt and my cousins would come while one uncle was deployed this way and Dad was deployed that way, and they'd come together and cook together.
Right.
And I remember silly things like we'd go to my dad's family in most of whom were still around Methuen and Gloucester, Massachusetts, and my cousins would have pie cooking contests. That was a traditional thing, and one of my cousins would make an incredible apple pie, and one made an amazing strawberry pie, and one made just an inedible cherry pie that she made every year, and it was a family
right.
joke, that this recipe somehow got worse and worse.
Right. Hope springs eternal.
Yes. But we, being the cousins who didn't frequently come to these things, would be polite and say, we'll have the cherry pie, and everyone would point and laugh and watch
right.
while we tried to kind of choke it down. But
right.
But yeah, so yeah, quite a bit of family too.
Oh, great. So now, moving forward in time, so you're in college. Is that when you started experimenting being a filmmaker?
It was earlier than that. I made my first movie in the backyard when I was in 5th grade.
Oh, really?
It was a remake of De Palma's Untouchables.
Oh, with all your friends?
All my friends, and we wore hats and trench coats and suits that were all way too big for us.
Right.
And we had little cap guns and little FBI badges and
on film?
Oh, on VHS.
On VHS?
On VHS.
Right.
And we ran around and did that. And I 2 or 3 times a year, I would invite all my friends over. We didn't own a camcorder. I had a friend who owned a VHS camcorder. Mm-hmm. He would bring it with him, and we would make something. And my parents would be very patient with us while we took over the house, or we had a scene where someone got shot in The Untouchables, and so we laid them on the kitchen floor and covered them with ketchup, and then got that all over the floor.
Right.
And my parents would very patiently let us kind of get away with it. And, so I loved making movies that early, and it carried on through all of it. Through high school, we had a little closed circuit TV show in the morning, and I would make little VHS projects and air them during homeroom. And then in college, I was actually in film classes and making
Right,
little
right.
little films.
Did you intend when you went to college to study filmmaking?
I did not. I always wanted, my dream was to be a filmmaker. But my parents were very worried early on about, because we didn't have a lot of money, and if I was going to go to college, their request was have a realistic goal.
Right.
And so somewhere in high school, I kind of let go of filmmaking as a career.
Mm-hmm.
And I pivoted. I wanted to be a history teacher, secondary ed, high school history teacher.
Mm.
And so I went to school with the intention of studying secondary education in American history. And my first choice school was Loyola College in Maryland, and I couldn't afford to go. And I got a scholarship offer, but it wasn't enough to get me there.
Right.
And I was completely dejected at the time. I remember just feeling crushed that I'd failed to make this happen.
Yeah, yeah.
And I went to Towson State University instead.
Right.
And they had a small mass communication program that had film classes. And so when I was filling out my freshman electives and signing up for all my secondary ed stuff, I on a lark, I said, why not, while I'm here, I'll go enjoy one class where I get to make little movies again.
Yeah, yeah.
And I took intro to film, and we had to shoot on 8mm. And halfway through the semester, I just said, "This is what I want."
This is it. Yeah,
yeah. And going to Towson ended up being the best thing that ever happened to me in my life at that time. I had no idea. Mm-hmm. And then I had to kind of negotiate between having a real career path, a quote unquote real career path, and pursuing the dream, and my parents, to their endless credit, while my dad in particular, I don't think really understood where the filmmaking stuff could go.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting how there's a certain kind of mindset. My dad was an immigrant, and for him, it was an anathema. It was like, you're going to become a gypsy.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah. I got to a point where I wanted to make an independent feature, and I was a junior. And my dad, who, and I understand this all now in a way I didn't then, my dad, who couldn't afford to do this, put up for him a substantial amount of money to invest in this movie, this mini DV feature movie that I shot.
How extraordinary.
Yeah. And it's one of the things I look back on, and for a lifelong career military man.
Right. Particularly somebody from that kind of background. Yeah.
Yeah. And who had been emphatic about, wanting me to pick a path that would lead to security. Right. For myself on the other side of it. To take a shot like that, and it's a profoundly supportive move, and one that I'm certain now must have been enormously uncomfortable for him, mm-hmm. emotionally and logistically.
Right. And
that I made my first feature film that way, and it was a little independent feature shot on mini DV, and that, as I remember, as soon as I finished the movie's not very good. Of course, it's a first movie, but I was completely hooked, and we wrapped that movie, and I immediately wanted to make another.
And that was the beginning of this what I consider to be an extraordinary career. I find it really interesting for my viewers and my listeners that I'm talking to somebody whom I had no knowledge of until I did Michael Rosenbaum's podcast. And Michael, we talked about you, and he said, I've got to get you guys together because I think you'd really get along. And then you and I spoke subsequently, and I just thought, he sounds like a very interesting man. I'd really love to talk to him. And so, I have to do my research. I got to start watching. And I watched something that, from what I understand, you consider to be something that's very close to you, which is a series that you did called Midnight Mass.
Yeah.
That affected me profoundly in a lot of different ways. First of all, because, a lot of people, we live in a time now when I first started, when I did a movie called Fright Night, okay, back in the 80s. And I was, at the time, I had a career that was, quote unquote, very kind of high class. I'd had an Academy Award nomination. I had done a bunch of Hallmark Hall of Fames, and, I played dual roles in the Tale of Two Cities. I mean, I thought I was hot stuff. And I got the script for Fright Night. And from the first moment I read it, aside from the fact that I thought, I can't do a movie called Fright Night with my career, and I read it and I thought, this is really terrific filmmaking. This has nothing to do with genre. This has to do with telling stories in a story, this very specific story, in a unique way. And after watching Midnight Mass, I thought, this is really a series of, it's a long form, but it's a film. Mm-hmm. It's an entire story with characters that you invest in, and that the quote unquote horror is in a way incidental to the character's development. That it's subtle, that it's not created in a way that is intended to shock as much as to make you feel and think. And I have to say, I'm an unabashed fan. And also, I'm going to just go fanboy completely, that a lot of I just finished watching Gerald's Game. And I noticed that both in Midnight Mass and Gerald's Game, that your heroes are often women. Tell me something about that, where that comes from.
I think a lot of that comes from my mother. She was my hero growing up. My dad was my hero too, but she was my hero every day. She was there,
right. Yeah, exactly.
And I think I learned very much watching her manage my brother and I in my dad's absence, and then watching her manage the household when he came back, because that was always a major adjustment for all of us, including him.
I'll bet.
I think I always grew up very much feeling like women were the heroes, and at least in my life were what I looked at as strength. Particularly interesting coming to somebody from a military family, which is I've always gravitated toward those stories. I find writing women is way more interesting to me. Mm-hmm. While there are male characters certainly that I've gotten to really, I think a lot of those were, and in Midnight Mass in particular, a lot of them are avatars for myself in a way that get uncomfortable. The character in Midnight Mass who I look at and I'm just like, God, it's almost a barely disguised version of all of my insecurities and failings, and those characters are really uncomfortable for me to really look at and dig into. Whereas, characters like Aaron Green in that show are more aspirational, and in Gerald's Game, I was lucky because Stephen King has a very similar similar penchant for that kind of storytelling, based in no small part on the way he was raised by his mother. And so he created this incredible protagonist, and the whole story is just living inside of her head, and so that was a dream job for me to come in and play with. But I'm sorry, I'm just very moved by what you said, and when we first met and spoke, I got to fanboy out on you for a very long time, because I've admired your career and your work so much, and and Fright Night was one of the first things I saw you in. And remains one of my favorites. But yeah, it just means a lot that you took the time to watch the stuff, and I'm really glad.
Oh well, all I can say is that the folks out there who might think in terms of the horror genre as something to avoid, you owe it to yourself to pay attention to some great filmmakers who are working in the genre, and I consider you to be certainly one of them. I'm also struck by the fact that you guys you call your company Intrepid Pictures, not Intrepid Films, and this is something of a kind of pet thing of mine about when you look back on the history of Hollywood. That I would hope that I think that you probably share the admiration that I have for the great directors of the American film canon that go back into the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, you name it. If you heard any of them talk about what they did, they talked about they worked in moving pictures.
Yeah.
Or movies. Pictures. Because they saw that as the succession of images that they put together. And I'm struck by that. Can you speak to that at all?
Oh, of course, and I agree with you so much. I think I'm a student of cinema and a fanboy of Hollywood and classic Golden Age Hollywood in particular.
Yeah, me too.
And listening to people talk about the pictures, we forget when the illusion is so complete, especially now. We forget that we are watching a series of pictures that go by in a way wherein the persistence of vision kicks in, and we trick ourselves into believing that we're experiencing motion and that we're sitting in the dark for half of, if we're in a movie theater, we're sitting in blackness for half of the experience. I think of movies and moving pictures and the pictures and the great picture shows, with such a nostalgic admiration. And films, to me, not only speaks of something more specific, even though back then, everything was celluloid.
Yeah, right.
I came up just at the end where it was no longer feasible for independent filmmakers to be working in film as their medium. Yeah. And I wanted so badly to work in film, but I couldn't afford to. I had to work in video. Most of the things that I've shot have been shot digital, all of them really professionally. Yeah. I shot films in college that I treasure, but my professional career has been entirely digital. And I have a self-conscious thing whenever we say, yes, it's a film. And it's is it? It's not. I still use it. And I still, all my life, I wanted to see the words of Mike Flanagan film, up there on the screen. Yep. And so I've got that, even though it's not accurate. But yeah, the pictures and listening to directors and producers and actors of those eras talking about the picture they're working on and what they need to do to accomplish this amazing picture. This picture is really going to be something special. And it is. It's a picture like a photograph, like a painting, it's such a specific thing. And now it's been replaced in so many circles by this awful word, content, that is just the most kind of belittling and manufactured word, and it just diminishes the glory of it and the majesty of it and the art of it, and it makes me sad. So I love Intrepid Pictures, and I love this idea that we're part of at least an echo of that incredible era of creativity.
Yeah, exactly. A quick question I wanted to ask you, because I noted as I thought back, and as I was thinking about our talking today, that there were food scenes in your movies, that there are food scenes in Midnight Mass, There are food scenes in Gerald's Game. Is there a specific way to you that those scenes function in your movies?
It's all about character, right? And if you're gonna do it, I think you can have the kind of rote version of it is you want to stage. In Midnight Mass, I staged a lot of conversations at the dinner table.
Yeah.
And it's two boys and their parents. And their dad's from a fishing community. And their mom's staying at home to cook. And it's very autobiographical. And so a lot of the conversations I felt they have to take place around the dinner table. The rote version of that is then you say, okay, so we're talking over dinner. What's easy for the prop master to make? Or what's the least intrusive for an actor who has to sit there all day
and eat?
Yeah. Or the wiser ones who we had a very younger actor at the table who hadn't been through this before, who just on the first take just started shoveling food in there.
Right.
And I watched everybody at the table kind of smile and say, just continuity wise, you're going to regret that about 5 hours from now
when you've eaten 5 meals.
Yeah.
Right.
And I'm watching Zach Gilford just rearrange his salad gently with his fork during the scene and, maybe lift 1 or 2 small baby greens into his mouth. And then otherwise pantomime chewing. And it's like, okay, there's a pro, so there's the mechanical side of it. But what I want to talk about is what would they eat? Ed, the dad, is a fisherman and grew up in this community that lives and dies by what they catch. Yeah,
they're on an island.
Yeah. And when we see him out on the boat, he's hauling crab. And it's like, okay, so what is that man putting on his plate? Because I guarantee it's different from what Zach's character, Riley, who's just been, escaped from the island as soon as he could and has been living in the city, but then spent the last 4 years in prison. What is he eating and what are his portions like? And all of this becomes an extension of character, how we interact with our food. In Gerald's Game, we made kind of a big deal about something that wasn't in the book. Gerald wanting to impress his wife on this romantic weekend, talks about how he got Kobe beef from Kobe, and that was the thing, is it's actually from there.
Which tells us everything we need to know in a way about him.
Yes. Yeah. And that was, how are we in a character who drops dead, spoiler alert, drops dead, 10 minutes into the movie.
Right.
I can do that because he's in the trailer. He's dead. I don't have much time to introduce this guy. And like you said, him making that declaration told us volumes. And so how these characters interact with food, what they choose to consume, how they choose to prepare it, who's preparing it versus who's consuming it and when. All of that behavior is fertile ground for storytelling and for character development without falling back on clunky expository dialogue. And forcing people to tell you who they are. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Why horror? Considering that, talking to you, and I'm not saying this in any kind of disparaging way, because I consider you to be a master filmmaker above all, movie maker above all. Why is this the genre that you have chosen to at least specialize in so far?
This is one of my favorite questions, and I'm really glad that you asked it. As a kid, I was very scared, and I think you can even see it. You can see it in the way I was scared of food. I was scared of them touching each other. I was scared of experiences I hadn't had. But I was scared of bullies, and I was scared of something happening to my dad, and I was scared of moving and having to kind of rebuild everything again, which happened frequently.
Yeah.
And so as a kid who was scared, and my peers were not, they were watching scary movies. They enjoyed them. I couldn't. I hid behind my fingers. I hid behind the couch. I didn't realize until I was kind of coming into high school, and I was trying to watch scary movies and read scary books so that I could fit in with the other kids.
Mm-hmm.
But I realized that if I could make it through a scene in a scary movie without covering my eyes and embarrassing myself, if I could make it to the end of a scary chapter in a book,
Mm-hmm.
that I was making myself a little bit braver in tiny, controlled increments. And that horror as a genre is an exercise in courage. It from the visceral sense of being scared you're going to get startled and protecting yourself, if you can push past that, to sometimes a profound sense where we can look at things otherwise we're too scared to look at in ourselves, in our hearts, in our society, in our world. We can look at them in a controlled and safe space that teaches us to rise to the occasion even 1%, be just a little more brave, a little more courageous.
Mm-hmm.
And the more we do it, the more that courage grows and can be carried into our real day-to-day lives. And I think horror for me was this thing that made me so uncomfortable. And now I am so hard to scare. And I attribute so much of my confidence and my growth and all of these wonderful things to being willing to look at something that's scary. And Midnight Mass, you mentioned, was very personal. And it is. It's, I'm 5 years sober. I come from a long line of problem drinkers, and looking at that is really scary. But looking at it in the context of that show was profound.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at my upbringing and looking at the things I feared as a kid and growing up Catholic and becoming a secular humanist atheist, all of these things, I pour all of that into the work. When I watched Night of the Living Dead for the first time, I thought I was watching a movie about zombies. And at the end of the movie, I realized I just watched a profound statement about racism in America. And it was so brilliantly hidden behind the trappings of the genre. And this light bulb went off where I thought, wow, if you want to make a movie about racism, you can make a profound one. You can make an incredible drama.
Right.
And there will be a small group of people that will seek out this kind of challenging material and embrace it. If you make a movie about zombies, that group of people is huge. And you give them all the trappings of the genre, and then at the end, what you're really about comes roaring out. And you've accomplished it all. You've entertained, you've offered this incredible escapism, but you've
catharsis.
Catharsis.
Yep.
And you've asked people to look at an uncomfortable truth and to confront it and to make themselves a little braver about their response to it. I think horror is woefully misunderstood as a genre.
I think less so now.
Yeah, it's getting better.
Less so now than it was when I first did the Fright Night. And people were saying, why are you doing this? That is, the business, the people who are in the know, quote unquote. I have one more question for you.
Yeah.
And that is, if you were to think about one moment in your young life, or one moment in your life even, that you return to as a result of a taste or a smell or something you ate or something you were around that had to do with food, what would that moment be? I
remember, and I still have this when I taste, it's the simplest thing, but it's peanut butter. Celery and peanut butter does this to me.
Yeah.
I remember having a really bad day, and I must have been in first or second grade. And I remember being scared about Dad. Dad was gone. I remember being bullied at school. And I remember coming home and I remember crying. I remember just being sad. Yeah. And I remember my mother making celery and peanut butter and sitting with me with her hand on my back while I sat and ate it. And the flavor of that, the kind of crunch of the celery and the flavor of the peanut butter, to this day, I've made it for my kids a few times who aren't as in love with it as I was. but I make it for them, and I'll take some when I make it for them, and that takes me back there, and I remember that feeling. And the other one that still gets me, while I was weird about pizza when I was a kid, it became such a staple, and I became quite in love with pizzerias. And I would go after school, and the smell of that. If I walk into a wonderful pizzeria, and there are some in New York that really knock me over, and it'd take me all the way back. And then I'm kind of in grade and middle school again, and I sitting with the backpack, and before you go home from school, and just feeling that scent that you feel like is going to be in your clothes when you leave, that it's that kind of everywhere.
Right.
That one takes me back a lot.
Does it?
Yeah.
Mike Flanagan, I can't tell you how much I enjoyed this conversation. I could continue talking for hours. I want to thank you so much for joining me and for joining us on Cooking by Heart.
It has been such a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I love what you do so much, and I love this podcast so much. I'm so grateful to be a part of it and to be catching up with it as a listener and a fan now. My mother is off listening to it now. So, yes, your audience is growing by the Flanagans. But thank you so much. It's been a joy.